All right, here we are at Chapter 8 in your social textbook entitled Building Canada. If you're watching this video, I assume you have already read this chapter. You have a rough idea of what happened. So I'm just going to go through it with you. I'm not going to read the textbook. I'm just going to pull out the important stuff, explain it a little bit more, maybe a little more detail, and ensure you truly understand it. This is probably the most important chapter in the textbook because it gives us the basis for what Canada is and where it came from. So it all is going to revolve around something called Confederation. So on July 1st, 1867, what is now what we know as Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario came together to form the Dominion of Canada, or the country of Canada. This was the result of the British Parliament passing the British North America Act. So the whole event, the whole idea behind it is called Confederation. Confederation happened largely because of a gentleman named John Alexander MacDonald, a name that I hope you have heard before today. So he was a lawyer who grew up in the colony of Canada. He lived in the colony of Canada. And he was chosen to represent voters in the government. During his time in government, before Canada was a country, he began to realize that there was a lot of issues that needed to be addressed across where all these people were settling. But because the people who lived in and around the colony of Canada, they came from France, they came from England, so they had very, very, very different backgrounds. And so trying to address all of these issues in a way that worked for everybody could be a bit of a challenge. However, he did come up with an idea to work together to form one country, and ultimately he became the first Prime Minister of Canada. So some of the difficulties that he noticed was that it was quite hard to trade between all these different settlements and colonies because they didn't have an organized transportation network. A lot of different places had different ways to weigh things, to measure things, which made trade even harder. They were potentially using different kinds of currencies, which made trade hard. And overall, that kind of leads to it was really difficult for people to make money. And if you want to survive somewhere, you need to have an economy, you need to have money. And if nobody's organized, an economy is not going to happen. The other kind of overlying thing was that there was no way to organize a defense. There was no way to have an army and move an army around because they were all tiny little colonies. So with the United States of America starting to come together, there was a serious worry that the U.S. could just walk in and take over these areas. So John A. MacDonald had a pretty big argument with the defense idea. So he came up with some ideas on how Confederation, or the joining of everybody into a country, would help these little colonies. So a single government would be better able to make decisions about schools, roads, canals, things like that. And it'd be easier to pay for these projects because all the money would be coming from one place. They would be using a single type of currency, so everybody would be able to exchange it. A single system of measurement could be used. They'd have enough money and resources to build a cross-country railroad, which was kind of the goal of everybody, even though they weren't organized. Easier to trade, which means everybody gets more money. They had a greater possibility of spreading further west, so expanding the territory they controlled. And they'd be better able to protect the eventual country from the United States. So better defense and way easier to move troops if there was a war. So that all sounds great. And it's why everything worked eventually, but there were some serious, serious challenges to consider. So we have two different major groups. We have Anglophones, so English speakers, and Francophones, or French speakers, and they had very, very, very different viewpoints. There was also the Atlantic colonies to consider because they had very different ways of life compared to the province of Canada. The people living in what would eventually be called the Maritimes, they were primarily fishing. They had a very different lifestyle than the English and French speakers that were inland. The Francophones were a minority in the area, so there was less French-speaking people. And if everybody got together to form a country, the Francophones were very, very, very worried about losing their language, losing their ability to practice their religion, to practice their culture. They would lose their identity, and ultimately they would lose their way of life if an English-speaking person got everybody together to form a country. And so it was a serious concern for them. But John A. Macdonald had a plan, and he was going to be able to overcome these challenges. He enlisted the help of a gentleman named Georges Etienne Cartier. He was a Francophone leader in Canada East, the French part of the province of Canada. He believed in Macdonald's idea of Confederation, and because of that, the two men worked closely together to move the idea forward. And Cartier promised to protect French interests. He wanted to keep the language around. He wanted to keep the religion, the culture, the identity. And in the end, they decided that Canada would have two official languages, French and English, making it ultimately a bilingual country, so two official languages. I'll just flip a couple pages here. All right. So the Charlottetown Conference of 1864 was a meeting that was held in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, with the leaders of the Atlantic colony, along with Macdonald and Cartier. They discussed the issues that the Atlantic colonies faced and how Confederation might help them. So the Macdonald and Cartier presented their ideas. People who attended the meeting had questions, and they just tried to answer them as best as possible. Similar meetings were held in Halifax, in St. John, Fredericton, as well as Quebec City. All right, the section down here, choosing to unite. So Macdonald and Cartier listened to all of the issues and challenges faced by the colonies. They listened to all the viewpoints, and they decided ultimately that Confederation was the best solution to make life better for all the citizens living in the area. On July 1st, 1867, three colonies, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and the province of Canada, Canada East and West, joined together to form the Dominion of Canada. The colony of Canada, the province of Canada, was divided into the provinces of Quebec and Ontario, as we know them today. New Brunswick and Nova Scotia also became provinces. What was decided was that the provinces would be in charge of schools, hospitals, and the communities, which is pretty much the same as it is today. And then Canada's government, the overall government, the federal government, which would be established in Ottawa, would take control of defense and trade between the provinces and between other countries. And this is a map similar to the one that I showed you if you look at the other video. And then the last little bit here, who was left out? And you can probably guess the answer to that. During the fur trade and the westward exploration, the First Nations people and the Europeans worked really closely together. They had to. If the First Nations people didn't help the Europeans, most of the Europeans would have died really quickly. So the Europeans needed the expertise. But as we moved forward in time, the fur trade became less and less important, which means that the Europeans felt that the First Nations were less and less important. And then eventually, when it came time to make decisions about Confederation, the values and the ideas of the First Nations people were not considered at all. The new government of Canada didn't view First Nations people as citizens of Canada. The government decided where the First Nations would live, which was usually on reserves, a word that you have probably heard before. They weren't allowed to vote unless they moved into a city, and they gave up their traditional ways of life. They became westernized. They had to become more like the ex-Europeans. And changes to this didn't really start until the 1960s. So just about 100 years later before we had any kind of changes to that. We'll get to that later. All right, so next time we'll take a peek at the railroad. Really cool section, and we'll go from there. See you next time.